The morning sun cut through the glass towers of Manhattan like a blade, cold and unforgiving. On the 47th floor of Meridian Global Holdings, the air smelled of expensive coffee and quiet desperation, the kind that comes when people know their jobs hang by threads thinner than the contracts they sign. Richard Langford stood at his office window, 72 years old, but still sharp as winter steel. His reflection stared back at him. Silver hair perfectly combed, a suit that cost more than most people earned in 3 months, eyes that had watched empires rise and fall. Behind him, his grandson and heir apparent, Marcus Langford, paced like a caged animal. "Grandfather, this is absurd," Marcus said, his voice tight with barely concealed impatience. "You're letting sentimentality cloud your judgment. The expansion into Southeast Asia requires decisive leadership, not what?" Richard turned slowly, his gaze pinning Marcus like a specimen under glass. "Not someone who understands that business is built by people, not algorithms." Marcus's jaw tightened. At 35, he had an MBA from Wharton, a track record of aggressive acquisitions, and absolutely no patience for what he called his grandfather's outdated humanist approach. The old man still believed in things like loyalty and character. Marcus believed in quarterly earnings and market dominance. "The board expects an announcement next week," Marcus pressed. "Either you name me CEO, or they'll start asking uncomfortable questions about your capacity to lead." Richard said nothing. He simply returned his gaze to the window, to the tiny figures moving 47 floors below. Invisible people, forgotten people, people who kept the machine running while men like Marcus reaped the rewards. "Get out," Richard said quietly. "Excuse me," I said. "Get out of my office. I need to think." Marcus opened his mouth, thought better of it, and left, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble like countdown timer. Richard waited until the door closed. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn leather notebook, his wife Catherine's journal from 40 years ago. He opened it to a page he'd read 1,000 times, her handwriting still clear despite the years. "Richard, my love, when you forget who you are, when the wealth and power make you forget where you came from, remember this. We judge ourselves by our intentions, but the world judges us by our actions. The measure of a man isn't what he builds, but who he becomes in the building." Catherine had died 10 years ago. Cancer, swift and merciless. She'd been the daughter of a janitor, the woman who'd seen past his family name to the scared young man beneath. She'd kept him human when the money threatened to make him a monster. And now, watching his grandson, watching the cold calculation in Marcus's eyes, Richard wondered if he'd failed her. Failed to pass on what mattered most. He closed the journal and picked up his phone, dialing his head of security. "Thomas, I need you to arrange something. Tomorrow morning, 9:15. I'm going to need your absolute discretion." The next morning arrived with the usual controlled chaos of corporate headquarters. In the service elevator, invisible to the executives who never looked twice at cleaning staff, rode Miguel Santos. 43 years old, Miguel had the kind of face that life had written on, laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a man who'd chosen joy despite everything, and deeper creases that told stories he'd never speak aloud. His janitor's uniform was spotless, pressed with the same care he'd once used on his paramedic's uniform, back when he'd had a different life. Back when his daughter Sophia was still alive. He pushed his cart through the 47th floor's marble corridors, nodding to the few people who bothered to notice him. Most didn't. To them, he was furniture that moved, a necessary function, like plumbing or electricity. Miguel had learned to prefer invisibility. It was safer than being seen, safer than remembering who he used to be. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. In his maintenance closet, Miguel pulled out his phone and looked at the single photo he carried. Sophia at 7 years old, gap-toothed and radiant, holding up a drawing she'd made of the two of them as superheroes. "Daddy and Sophia, save the day," was written in crayon across the top. She'd been 8 when the drunk driver took her. Miguel had been working a double shift at the hospital, trying to earn enough for the ballet lessons she wanted. His wife, Maria, had been driving Sophia home from practice. The other driver walked away with a broken arm. Sophia and Maria didn't walk away at all. Miguel had stopped being a paramedic after that. Stopped saving lives. Because what was the point when he couldn't save the only lives that mattered? He put the phone away and pushed his cart back into the hallway. Work was work. It kept his hands busy and his mind quiet. That was enough. That had to be enough. At 9:14, Miguel was cleaning the executive corridor, buffing the marble to a shine that would last exactly 3 hours before someone's careless footsteps dulled it again. The hallway was empty. Most executives were in a morning strategy session on the 45th floor, exactly as Richard Langford had planned. At 9:15, Richard Langford stepped out of his office. He stood there for just a moment, noting Miguel's position 30 feet away, his back turned, focused on his work. Richard took 3 steps forward. Then he clutched his chest, his face contorting in what appeared to be genuine agony, and collapsed onto the cold marble floor. The sound echoed through the empty corridor like a gunshot. Miguel's head snapped up, his first instinct buried under 5 years of deliberate numbness, roared back to life with terrifying clarity. He saw the elderly man on the ground, saw the way his body was positioned, saw the hand clutching the chest. Cardiac event. Possible myocardial infarction. Patient unresponsive. The clinical assessment came automatically, a ghost language from a life he'd abandoned. Miguel's cart clattered as he shoved it aside, his legs already moving before his mind caught up. He dropped to his knees beside Richard, his hands moving with the muscle memory of 1,000 emergency calls. 2 fingers to the carotid artery, checking for pulse. Weak but present. Airway assessment. Breathing shallow. "Sir," Miguel said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline screaming through his veins. "Sir, can you hear me? My name is Miguel. I'm going to help you." Richard's eyes fluttered. A perfect performance. He'd studied videos of heart attack victims, practiced the subtle signs. But something in Miguel's face made him pause. This wasn't just concern. This was expertise. This was instinct. Miguel's hands were already loosening Richard's tie, unbuttoning the top button of his shirt to improve circulation. His other hand pulled out his phone, dialing 911 with practiced precision. "This is Miguel Santos calling from Meridian Global Holdings, 47th floor, executive corridor. I have an elderly male, approximately 70 years old, possible cardiac event. Patient is semi-conscious, pulse weak and thready, breathing shallow. We need immediate paramedic response." As he spoke, his free hand checked Richard's pockets, looking for medication, for a medical alert bracelet, for anything that might indicate pre-existing conditions. He found a nitroglycerin tablet in Richard's jacket pocket. "Sir, do you take this for your heart?" Miguel asked, holding up the small pill bottle. "I'm going to place one under your tongue. Don't swallow. Just let it dissolve." Richard's act faltered for just a second. The janitor, the man everyone ignored, was performing emergency first aid with the precision of a trained professional. Where had this come from? But Miguel wasn't done. He positioned Richard carefully on his side, recovery position to prevent aspiration if he vomited. He grabbed his own janitor's jacket and rolled it into a makeshift cushion for Richard's head. His hand stayed on Richard's wrist, monitoring the pulse, counting the beats against his own internal clock. "Stay with me, sir," Miguel said softly. "Ambulance is 3 minutes out. You're going to be okay. Just focus on breathing. In through your nose, out through your mouth." That's it. Behind them, the elevator dinged. Thomas Reed, head of security, stepped out with 2 other guards, exactly as planned. They'd been watching from the security office, waiting for Richard's signal to intervene. But Thomas stopped dead when he saw the scene. The janitor wasn't panicking. He wasn't calling for help uselessly or standing frozen. He was performing textbook emergency response. Thomas spoke into his radio. "Hold the paramedics at the lobby." "Repeat, hold at lobby." Miguel's head whipped around. "What?" "No, he needs immediate medical." "Stand down," Thomas said, but his voice was uncertain now, not commanding. Miguel's eyes went hard. "This man is having a cardiac event. Every second counts. If you delay those paramedics." "I'm okay," Richard said suddenly, his voice stronger than it should be. He sat up slowly, Miguel's hand immediately moving to support his back, still operating on protective instinct. "Sir, don't move," Miguel urged. "You need to stay still until—" "I'm not having a heart attack," Richard interrupted gently. Miguel froze. His hands still supported Richard's shoulders, but his mind was catching up, processing, understanding flooding him like ice water. This was a test. Miguel's voice was barely a whisper. Richard met his eyes. "Yes." Miguel's hands dropped. He sat back on his heels, his face cycling through disbelief, hurt, and finally resignation. "A test. 17 people walked past me this morning," Richard said quietly, still sitting on the floor. 17 employees of this company. Executives, managers, administrative staff. Not one stopped. Not one even looked. Miguel stood slowly, backing away, his professional mask cracking. "So you thought you'd see if the janitor would fall for it?" "No," Richard said, his voice carrying surprising weight. "I wanted to see if anyone in this building still had a soul." The words hung in the air between them. Miguel stared at the old man, at the expensive suit now wrinkled on the marble floor, at the calculated performance that had just weaponized his deepest instincts. "I have to get back to work," Miguel said finally, his voice flat. He turned toward his abandoned cart. "Wait." Richard stood, brushing off his pants. "What's your name?" "Miguel Santos, sir. Janitorial services." "Miguel Santos," Richard repeated, as if tasting the name. "You knew exactly what to do. That wasn't first aid training from an orientation video. That was professional medical response." Miguel said nothing. His hands gripped the handle of his cart, knuckles white. "You checked for pulse positioning, did an airway assessment, identified my medication, called emergency services with precise information, and positioned me for recovery. That's paramedic-level training." Still, Miguel said nothing. "Why are you cleaning floors when you could be saving lives?" The question hit Miguel like a physical blow. His jaw tightened. When he spoke, his voice was barely controlled. "Because I couldn't save the lives that mattered." Richard watched him, really watched him, seeing past the uniform to the fractures beneath. "Who did you lose?" "With respect, Mr. Langford, that's none of your business." Miguel's voice was polite but final. He pushed his cart toward the service elevator. "Miguel," Richard called after him. Miguel stopped but didn't turn around. "Thank you," Richard said simply. "For stopping. For caring. For being who you are even when it cost you something to show it." Miguel's shoulders tightened. Then he continued walking, disappearing into the service elevator, the doors closing on his carefully blank expression. Richard stood alone in the hallway, Thomas approaching cautiously. "Sir," Thomas said, "we have the footage from every corridor camera. 17 people saw you. 3 stepped over you. 14 crossed to the other side of the hall. 0 stopped to help. And 1 man who had every reason to walk away, stopped anyway," Richard said quietly. "Find out everything about Miguel Santos. Every detail. I want his full history on my desk by end of day." "Sir, is this about the succession?" "This is about remembering what Catherine tried to teach me," Richard interrupted. "We've built an empire of wealth and forgotten to build people of worth. Miguel Santos just showed me the difference." As Thomas left to carry out his orders, Richard returned to his office and picked up Catherine's journal again. He read the passage once more, her words feeling like both a rebuke and a roadmap. Somewhere in this building, a janitor was pushing his cart through empty hallways, trying to forget that for just a few minutes, he'd remembered who he used to be. Trying to forget that even 5 years and an ocean of grief later, the instinct to save lives still lived in his hands. And in his office, a billionaire sat with a leather journal and a decision that would change everything. Not just for him, but for every person in the building who'd learned to walk past suffering without seeing it. The test was over, but the real examination was just beginning. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, a manila folder landed on Richard Langford's desk with a soft thud that felt heavier than it should. Thomas Reed stood at attention, his expression carefully neutral. "Everything we could find on Miguel Santos, sir." "It's not what I expected." Richard opened the folder. The first page was a standard employment record, Miguel Santos, hired 5 years ago through a temp agency, moved to full-time janitorial staff after 6 months. Perfect attendance. 0 complaints. 0 commendations either. He was invisible in the way only the most reliable people can be, doing his job so well that no one noticed he was there. But the second page made Richard's breath catch. Miguel Antonio Santos, former senior paramedic, Mount Sinai Hospital Emergency Services. 13 years of service. Specialty, pediatric trauma response. Decorated twice for exceptional performance under crisis conditions. Left position voluntarily, August 2018. The folder included newspaper clippings. Richard spread them across his desk, his hands trembling slightly. Drunk driver kills mother and daughter in Queens collision. The photo showed a mangled sedan, emergency lights painting the scene in harsh blue and red. The article detailed how Maria Santos, 34, and her daughter Sofia Santos, 8, were killed instantly when a driver with twice the legal blood alcohol limit ran a red light at 70 miles per hour. Another clipping, smaller, from 6 months later. Mount Sinai loses veteran paramedic to resignation. Miguel Santos, a 13-year veteran of our emergency response team, has chosen to step away from medicine, said Chief of Emergency Services Dr. Patricia Holmes. Miguel saved countless lives during his tenure here. We understand his decision and wish him well, though the department will feel his absence deeply. The next page was a psychological evaluation. Somehow Thomas had obtained it, though Richard decided not to ask how. It was dated 3 months after the accident. Patient presents with severe, complicated grief, survivor's guilt, and symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress disorder. States he can no longer trust his hands and experiences intrusive thoughts when performing medical procedures. Recommendation: extended leave, continued therapy, possible career counseling for transition to non-medical field. Richard closed the folder and pressed his palms against his eyes. When he'd staged his collapse this morning, he'd been testing for basic human decency. He hadn't expected to find a man who'd lost everything but still couldn't suppress the instinct to save a stranger. "There's more," Thomas said quietly. He pulled out his phone and showed Richard a photo. "This is from the building's parking garage, taken 2 hours ago." The image showed Miguel sitting in an old Honda Civic, his forehead pressed against the steering wheel. Even in the grainy security footage, the posture of defeat was unmistakable. "He sat like that for 40 minutes, Thomas continued. Then he went back inside and finished his shift. Richard stood and walked to the window, his jaw tight. 47 floors below, the city moved with indifferent speed. How many Miguel Santoses were down there? How many broken people were holding themselves together with nothing but routine and silence? "I need you to arrange something else," Richard said finally. "Tomorrow morning, same time, same place. But this time I want you to bring me every personnel file of the executives and managers who walk past me. Sir, if one janitor can show more humanity than 17 highly paid professionals, then we have a cultural problem that needs addressing. Starting at the top." Thomas nodded slowly. "And Miguel Santos?" Richard turned, his expression unreadable. "Leave him alone. For now. But I want to know his schedule, his routes, where he takes his breaks. I'm not done understanding who he is. Sir, with respect, he might not appreciate being studied like a specimen." "No," Richard agreed. "He wouldn't, which is why he won't know about it." The next morning, Richard didn't stage another collapse. Instead, he arrived at the office at 6 a.m., 2 hours before his usual time, and took a service elevator to the 47th floor. Miguel was already there, buffing the marble outside the conference room. He worked with methodical precision, his headphones in, his world reduced to the small circle of floor in front of him. Richard watched from the shadows of an alcove, struck by the loneliness of the scene. A man working in a building full of people, utterly alone. Richard pulled out his phone and composed a message to his assistant. "Cancel my 8 o'clock. Reschedule the board prep meeting. I'll be unavailable until noon." Then he walked forward, his expensive shoes clicking against the marble. Miguel's head came up. When he saw Richard, something flickered across his face. Recognition, wariness, resignation. He pulled out his headphones. Mr. Langford, Miguel said, his voice professionally neutral. I didn't expect anyone this early. I can move to a different floor if... No, Richard interrupted. Actually, I was hoping we could talk. Miguel's expression didn't change, but his posture tensed slightly. About what, sir? About yesterday. About what you did. I responded to what I thought was an emergency. Miguel said carefully. If I overstepped my position. You saved my life, Richard interrupted. Or you would have if I'd actually been dying. Yes, well. Miguel bent to unplug his buffer. I'm sure you have work to do. I'll get out of your way. Miguel, please. Richard's voice carried a note the janitor hadn't heard before. Not command, but request. 5 minutes. That's all I'm asking. Miguel straightened slowly, his hands still gripping the buffer's handle like an anchor. What do you want from me, Mr. Langford? The truth. Richard gestured to a bench near the window. Why did you stop? You were on the floor. You appear to be having a heart attack. 17 other people saw me and kept walking. Then they're cowards, Miguel said simply. Or they convinced themselves someone else would handle it. People are good at that, convincing themselves that problems aren't theirs to solve. Richard absorbed this. Is that what you tell yourself? That other people's problems aren't yours to solve? Miguel's jaw tightened. I'm just trying to get through my shifts, Mr. Langford. I don't need philosophical interrogation. You were a paramedic. The words hung between them like a blade. Miguel went very still. I know about Mount Sinai, Richard continued quietly. I know about your 13 years of service. I know about the commendations. And I know about August 15th, 2018. Miguel's face drained of color. You investigated me? I wanted to understand why a trained paramedic was cleaning my floors instead of saving lives. Maybe because I got tired of watching people die, Miguel said, his voice hardening. Maybe because I realized that all the training in the world doesn't matter when a drunk with a Lexus decides red lights are optional. Your daughter. Don't. Miguel's voice cracked like ice breaking. Don't say her name. You don't get to say her name. Richard raised his hands, backing off slightly. I'm sorry. I overstepped. Miguel turned away, facing the window, his shoulders rigid. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I was working a double shift. Try to earn enough for ballet lessons. Sophia wanted to dance. She showed me videos every night. Misty Copeland, New York City Ballet, the whole dream. She was good. Really good. He paused, his reflection ghostly in the glass. My wife was driving her home from practice. I got the call at the hospital. Drunk driver, multiple casualties, pediatric trauma. I grabbed my kit and ran for the ambulance. I didn't know it was them. Not until I saw the car. Richard said nothing, just listened. Sophia died instantly. The doctor said she didn't feel anything. Maria lived long enough for them to get her to the hospital. Long enough for me to hold her hand while she asked me to take care of our baby. I couldn't tell her that our baby was already gone. Miguel's voice broke completely. So don't ask me why I'm cleaning floors, Mr. Langford. Don't ask me why I walked away from medicine. Because every time I put my hands on someone, all I see is them. Every time I try to save someone, I remember that I couldn't save the only people who mattered. The silence that followed was profound. Richard stood there, a man who'd built empires and commanded boardrooms, and found himself with absolutely nothing to say that could bridge the chasm of that grief. Finally, Miguel wiped his face roughly and turned back to his buffer. Is that what you wanted to know? Is your curiosity satisfied? No, Richard said quietly. What I want to know is why you stopped yesterday. If you've convinced yourself you can't save anyone, why did your hands remember differently? Miguel froze. The question hit something deep. Because, he said finally, his voice raw, because maybe I'm tired of being the person who walks past. Maybe I'm tired of pretending that shutting down makes the pain stop. It doesn't. It just makes you numb. And numb isn't the same as healed. Richard absorbed this, turning it over in his mind. What if I told you that you're not the only one who's been walking through life numb? Miguel looked at him, really looked at him, seeing past the expensive suit for the first time. My wife, Catherine, died 10 years ago, Richard said. Cancer. She was the only person who ever saw me as more than the Langford name and the Langford money. After she was gone, I threw myself into work, built the company bigger, made more money than we could spend in 10 lifetimes. And every night, I went home to an empty penthouse and pretended that success was the same thing as meaning. He gestured around the gleaming corridor. I've spent the last decade building an empire where people walk past each other suffering, where 17 executives and managers saw a man collapsed on the floor and decided their meetings were more important. I created this culture, Miguel. Me. And yesterday, the only person who stopped was the one person who had every reason not to. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Miguel's expression softened slightly. Why did you really stage that collapse, Mr. Langford? Because my grandson wants me to step down. He wants to take over as CEO. And I've been watching him turn to something I don't recognize. Someone who sees people as assets and liabilities instead of human beings. I needed to know if there was anyone left in this building who remembered what compassion looked like. Richard paused, his voice dropping. Catherine kept a journal. She wrote that we judge ourselves by our intentions, but the world judges us by our actions. I've spent 10 years judging myself as a success while my actions built a place where decency is so rare that when someone shows it, it's shocking. Miguel set down the buffer completely now, giving Richard his full attention. I don't need your pity, Mr. Langford, Miguel said carefully. And I don't need to be your redemption project. No, Richard agreed. But maybe we need to stop lying to ourselves about who we've become. The words hung between them. Two men standing in an empty corridor at dawn, both trying to figure out how to live with their ghosts. I can't go back to being a paramedic, Miguel said finally. I can't trust my hands anymore. Every time I tried after the accident, I froze. Full panic attack. The chief suggested I transition to teaching, but I couldn't stand in front of other medics and pretend I still believed in what we did. What if you didn't have to go back to medicine? Richard asked. Miguel looked wary. What are you proposing? I don't know yet, Richard admitted. But I know that you're wasted pushing a buffer around my building. And I know that yesterday, for just a few minutes, I watched you become the person you used to be. The person who couldn't walk past suffering even when it cost him something. That person got his family killed, Miguel said bitterly. No, a drunk driver killed your family. You were trying to provide for them. There's a difference. Miguel shook his head. You don't understand. If I hadn't been working that double shift, if you hadn't been working that shift, you'd have been in the car with them, Richard interrupted gently. And Sophia would have lost both parents instead of one. You didn't cause what happened, Miguel. You survived it. Those aren't the same thing. The words hit Miguel like a physical blow. He sat down heavily on the bench, his head in his hands. Richard sat beside him, carefully maintaining distance but offering presence. My wife used to say that grief is just love with nowhere to go, Richard said quietly. The love doesn't die just because the person does. It keeps living in you, looking for somewhere to land. Maybe that's why you stopped yesterday. Because all that love you have for Sophia and Maria, it needed somewhere to go. Miguel's shoulders shook silently. Richard didn't try to comfort him, didn't offer platitudes. He just sat there, two men with empty houses and full hearts, watching the sun rise over Manhattan. After a long while, Miguel spoke. What happens now? I don't know, Richard admitted. But I know I'm tired of pretending this is enough. He gestured at the opulent corridor. All of this, the money, the power, the empire, Catherine would be ashamed of what I've built here. Not the company, the culture, the coldness. He turned to Miguel. Help me change it. Miguel looked at him like he'd suggested they fly to the moon. I'm a janitor, Mr. Langford. I push a buffer and empty trash cans. You're a man who stopped when everyone else walked past. You're a man who spent 13 years saving lives and 5 years trying to forget how. You're a man who lost everything and still couldn't suppress the instinct to help a stranger. Richard's voice intensified. That's not a janitor. That's exactly the kind of person who should be teaching others what it means to be human. I don't even know what that means anymore. Neither do I, Richard said. But maybe we can figure out together. Miguel sat back, overwhelmed. This is insane. You're one of the wealthiest men in the country. I live in a studio apartment in Queens and eat ramen 4 nights a week. We're from different worlds. Catherine was a janitor's daughter, Richard said quietly. When I met her, I was a trust fund kid who thought money made me special. She taught me that character isn't something you're born with. It's something you choose every day in the small moments when no one's watching. Yesterday, in that corridor, you made that choice. And it reminded me of who I used to be before I forgot. Miguel stood slowly, steadying himself against the window. Below them, the city was waking up. Millions of people beginning another day, most of them invisible to the people in towers like this. I need to think about this, Miguel said finally. Take all the time you need, Richard replied. But Miguel, whatever you decide, thank you. For stopping. For remembering. For showing me that there's still someone in this building who gives a damn about something other than profit margins. Miguel nodded and returned to his buffer. But as he worked, Richard noticed something different in his posture. Less defeated, more thoughtful. The way a man looks when he's considering possibilities he thought were dead. Richard returned to his office and found Marcus waiting, impatience radiating from every line of his expensive suit. Grandfather, we need to discuss the succession plan. The board meeting is in 3 days, and the board can wait, Richard said, moving past him to his desk. Wait. Marcus's voice rose. We have investors expecting clarity. We have expansion plans that require decisive leadership. We have a company full of people who walk past suffering without blinking, Richard interrupted. We have executives who wouldn't stop to help a dying man because their calendars were full. We have a culture that rewards cruelty and mistakes it for efficiency. Marcus stared at him. Is this about yesterday? About your little test? Yes. One janitor stopped to help you, and now you're having a crisis of conscience. Marcus's laugh was bitter. Grandfather, sentiment doesn't build empires. No, Richard agreed. But it builds something more important. It builds the kind of place where people want to work, where they want to give their best, where they don't become hollow versions of themselves just to survive. That's not how the world works. Then maybe we change how the world works, Richard said quietly. Starting with this company. Starting with us. Marcus's expression hardened. If you're suggesting we turn Meridian Global into some kind of charity, I'm suggesting we remember that profit and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. Your grandmother understood that. She built programs for employee wellness, for family support, for community investment. And in case you've forgotten, the company was more profitable under her influence than it's been in the 10 years since she died. Marcus opened his mouth, then closed it. You want to be CEO? Richard continued. Then show me you understand what that means. Not just financial performance, not just market dominance. Show me you understand that the measure of a leader is what happens in the moments when no one's watching. When someone needs help and everyone else is too busy to care. And if I can't show you that, Richard met his grandson's eyes with steel in his own. Then I'll find someone who can. The threat hung in the air between them. Marcus's face cycled through shock, anger, and finally calculation. This is about the janitor, isn't it? You're actually considering. I'm considering a lot of things, Richard interrupted. Now, get out. I have work to do. After Marcus left, slamming the door behind him, Richard sat at his desk and pulled out Catherine's journal once more. He turned to a page near the end, written just weeks before she died. Richard, my darling, I know you're afraid of what comes after I'm gone. Afraid you'll forget who you are without me to remind you. But you won't. The man I fell in love with is still in there. He's the one who stopped his car in the rain to help a stranger change a tire. The one who anonymously paid for that family's hospital bills. The one who sees people, really sees them, even when the world tells him they're invisible. Don't let grief make you forget him. Don't let wealth make him disappear. He's worth more than any empire. Richard closed his eyes, tears sliding down his weathered face. I'm trying, Catherine, he whispered to the empty office. I'm trying. 3 days later, the boardroom on the 48th floor buzzed with the particular tension that comes before power shifts. 18 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, their faces carrying the practiced neutrality of people who'd spent decades making decisions that affected thousands of lives. Marcus Langford stood at the head of the table, his presentation polished to perfection. Behind him, charts projected onto the screen, growth projections, acquisition targets, efficiency metrics that reduced human beings to percentages and dollar signs. As you can see, Marcus said, his voice confident and cold, "Under my leadership, Meridian Global will achieve 17% growth year over year. We'll accomplish this through strategic workforce reduction, automation of service positions, and aggressive expansion into emerging markets." Richard sat at the far end of the table, his face unreadable. He hadn't spoken yet, hadn't interrupted, just watched his grandson present a vision of the future that looked remarkably like the past, efficient, profitable, and utterly devoid of soul. "Questions?" Marcus asked, scanning the room. Margaret Chun, the CFO and longest-serving board member, raised her hand. "Marcus, your projections show eliminating the entire janitorial and facility staff in favor of contracted services. Can you explain the rationale?" "Cost efficiency," Marcus replied smoothly. "Contracted labor reduces our overhead by 42%. We eliminate benefits, pensions, and the administrative burden of managing low-skill positions." "Low-skill positions," Richard repeated quietly. Every head turned toward him. "Is that what we're calling the people who keep this building running?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "Grandfather, with respect, we're discussing fiscal responsibility, not sentiment." "No," Richard said, standing slowly. "We're discussing what kind of company we want to be." He walked to the window, looking down at the city below. 3 days ago, I staged a collapse in the executive corridor. A test, if you will. Murmurs rippled through the room. Marcus's face went pale. 17 people, executives, managers, professionals we trust with million-dollar decisions, walked past me. Some stepped over me. Most crossed to the other side of the hallway. 0 stopped to help. Richard turned back to face them. The only person who stopped was Miguel Santos. A janitor. One of those low-skill positions you want to eliminate. Margaret leaned forward. "Richard, what are you saying?" "I'm saying that we've built a culture where compassion is so rare that when someone demonstrates it, it's shocking. Where the lowest-paid person in the building showed more leadership than every highly compensated executive combined." Marcus interrupted, his voice sharp. "One act of basic first aid doesn't qualify someone to—" Miguel Santos is a former senior paramedic with 13 years of emergency services experience, Richard said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "He has specialty training in pediatric trauma. He's been decorated twice for exceptional performance under crisis conditions. He performed textbook emergency response on me. Pulse check, airway assessment, medication identification, proper positioning, professional 911 call with precise information." The room went silent. "He's been cleaning our floors for 5 years, Richard continued. 5 years of walking these corridors, invisible to every single one of us. We never asked who he was. We never looked past the uniform. We never saw the man who'd saved countless lives before tragedy broke him." "Why did he leave medicine?" someone asked quietly. Richard's voice softened. "Because a drunk driver killed his wife and 8-year-old daughter while he was working a double shift to pay for his child's ballet lessons. Because grief and survivor's guilt convinced him he couldn't trust his hands anymore. Because our society is very good at using people up and throwing them away when they're wounded." Margaret pressed a hand to her mouth. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "So, when you talk about eliminating low-skill positions," Richard said, looking directly at Marcus, "remember that you're talking about human beings. People with histories. People with skills we never bothered to discover because we decided their job title defined their worth." Marcus's face flushed red. "This is emotional manipulation. We're running a business, not a charity." "Catherine would be ashamed of you," Richard said quietly. The words landed like a bomb. Marcus recoiled as if struck. "Your grandmother built this company on the principle that profit and humanity aren't mutually exclusive. She created employee wellness programs, educational scholarships, community investment initiatives. And under her influence, this company was more profitable than it's been in the decades since she died." Richard walked slowly around the table, making eye contact with each board member. "I've spent 10 years trying to fill the hole she left with money and power. I've built bigger. I've earned more. And I've created a place where 17 people can walk past a dying man without flinching. That's my legacy. That's what I've accomplished. He stopped behind his chair, gripping the back of it with white knuckles. So here's what's going to happen. Effective immediately, I'm implementing a company-wide culture review. Every employee, from mailroom to boardroom, will undergo leadership training focused on emotional intelligence, crisis response, and basic human decency. We're establishing a program to identify employees with hidden skills or credentials, like Miguel, and help them transition to positions that match their capabilities. Richard, Margaret said gently, that's going to cost millions. Good, Richard replied. Let it cost millions. Let it cut into our profit margin. Because I'd rather build a company where people want to work, where they want to give their best, than one more soulless machine that extracts value and discards humanity. Marcus slammed his hand on the table. This is insane. You're willing to tank the company's performance because one janitor was nice to you. No, Richard said, his voice cold as winter. I'm willing to remember what matters because one man showed me I'd forgotten. There's a difference. The board will never support this. Richard looked around the table. Won't you? The silence stretched long and uncomfortable. Then Margaret spoke, her voice thick with emotion. My father was a custodian, she said quietly. Worked at a hospital for 30 years. He had a master's degree in chemistry, but he couldn't find work in his field after we immigrated. So he cleaned floors and raised 3 kids and never once complained. He died believing he'd failed because his job title didn't match his education. She looked at Richard with tears in her eyes. I support your proposal. Every word of it. One by one, other board members nodded. Not all of them. 3 remained stone-faced, aligned with Marcus's vision. But 12 out of 18 raised their hands. Marcus stood frozen, his carefully constructed future crumbling around him. The vote is clear, Richard said. This company moves forward with humanity intact. Marcus, you can be part of that transformation, or you can leave. Your choice. You're making a mistake, Marcus said, his voice shaking with rage. Maybe, Richard agreed, but it's my mistake to make. And I'd rather fail trying to build something worth building than succeed at creating another empire without a soul. Marcus gathered his papers with shaking hands and walked toward the door. He paused at the threshold, looking back at his grandfather with something like betrayal in his eyes. Grandmother would have wanted me to lead this company. No, Richard said gently. She would have wanted you to be worthy of leading it. There's a difference. Maybe someday you'll understand that. The door closed behind Marcus with a soft click that felt like the end of an era. Miguel was cleaning the 43rd floor when security found him 2 hours later. Mr. Santos? Mr. Langford would like to see you in his office. Miguel's stomach dropped. This was it. He'd been expecting it. The polite dismissal, the severance package, the end of the only stability he'd found in 5 years. He'd shown too much, said too much. Let Richard Langford see the broken places. He took the elevator up, his heart pounding. When he entered the office, he found Richard standing at the window, Catherine's journal open on his desk. Mr. Langford, if this is about our conversation. Sit down, Miguel, Richard interrupted, not unkindly. Miguel sat, his hands gripping his knees. Richard turned to face him. I just got out of a board meeting where I essentially blew up my grandson's career and committed this company to a complete cultural overhaul. Want to know why? Miguel said nothing, just waited. Because you reminded me what Catherine spent 40 years trying to teach me. That the measure of a person isn't their bank account or their job title. It's what they do when nobody's watching. When helping cost them something. When walking away would be easier. Richard sat down across from Miguel. I can't make you a paramedic again. I understand that door is closed, but I can offer you something else. Mr. Langford, I don't need charity. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering a position. Director of Human Resources and Employee Wellness. Miguel stared at him. What? You'd be responsible for overseeing the new culture initiative. Training programs. Employee support systems. Making sure that what happened to you, being invisible, being overlooked, having your skills wasted, doesn't happen to anyone else here. I'm not qualified for that. I don't have HR experience. I don't have. You have something better. Richard interrupted. You have empathy. You have the ability to see people who've become invisible. You know what it's like to be broken and still show up. That's what I need. That's what this company needs. Miguel shook his head, overwhelmed. This is insane. People will never accept a janitor suddenly. Then we'll deal with it. Together. Richard leaned forward. Miguel, I'm 72 years old. I've built an empire and lost the person who made it meaningful. I've spent a decade being numb and calling it success. You showed me that numb isn't the same as healed. Let me show you the same thing. I can't just forget what happened, Miguel said, his voice breaking. Sophia and Maria, they're still gone. That doesn't change. No, Richard agreed. But maybe you can stop punishing yourself for surviving. Maybe you can take all that love you still have for them and let it land somewhere meaningful. Help other people. Build something that honors who they were and who you were before you lost them. Tears streamed down Miguel's face. I don't know if I can do this. Neither do I, Richard admitted. But I'm tired of playing it safe. I'm tired of letting fear make my decisions. Catherine wouldn't have wanted that for me. And I don't think Maria and Sophia would want it for you. The name, spoken aloud by someone who had no right to know it, should have felt like a violation. Instead, it felt like permission. Permission to remember. Permission to honor. Permission to live. Miguel wiped his face roughly. If I do this, if I even try, I need to do it my way. No corporate nonsense. No pretending that programs and policies can replace genuine human connection. Agreed. And I need to be able to fail. To admit when I'm wrong. To ask for help when I'm drowning. Also agreed. Miguel took a shaky breath. When would I start? Tomorrow. If you're ready. If you're not, we'll wait until you are. For a long moment, Miguel sat in silence. Then he pulled out his phone and looked at the photo of Sophia, gap-toothed and radiant, holding up her superhero drawing. Daddy and Sophia saved the day. Maybe, he thought, maybe saving the day doesn't have to mean emergency rooms and ambulances. Maybe it can mean seeing people who've become invisible. Maybe it can mean building a place where compassion isn't shocking, but expected. Maybe that's a different kind of saving, but saving nonetheless. Tomorrow, Miguel said finally, looking up at Richard. I'll start tomorrow. Richard smiled, not the practice smile of a CEO, but the genuine smile of a man who just found his way back to something real. Thank you, Miguel, for stopping, for caring, for reminding an old man what matters. Thank you for seeing me, Miguel replied, for asking who I was instead of just what I did. They shook hands, not employer and employee, not billionaire and janitor, but two men who'd both learned that the hardest thing in the world is to keep showing up when everything in you wants to disappear. 6 months later, Meridian Global Holdings looked different. Not in the obvious ways. The marbles still gleamed, the offices still stretched toward the sky. But the feeling had changed. People smiled more, asked each other about weekends and families, stopped in hallways to actually see each other. The culture training program that Miguel designed wasn't about corporate buzzwords or HR policies. It was about stories, about recognizing that every person in the building carried invisible histories, about understanding that compassion isn't weakness, but the foundation of genuine leadership. Miguel walked the floors in a suit now, but he still knew every janitor's name, still stopped to help when someone dropped papers in the hallway, still carried that photo of Sophia in his pocket, a reminder of why he did this work. Richard stepped down as CEO 6 months after the board meeting, transitioning to chairman emeritus. He spent his time mentoring young leaders and overseeing the Catherine Langford Foundation for Employee Wellness, named for the woman who'd taught him that profit without purpose was just emptiness with better accounting. Marcus never returned to Meridian. He took a position at a competitor, built his own empire of efficiency and cold calculation. Richard still sent him birthday cards every year, still hoped that someday his grandson would understand. But he didn't wait for that understanding to do what needed doing. And on a Tuesday morning in October, Miguel stood in the executive corridor, the same place where Richard had collapsed 6 months earlier, and watched as a young administrative assistant tripped and spilled coffee everywhere. 3 executives immediately stopped to help. One grabbed napkins. Another helped her gather scattered papers. A third asked if she was okay, really okay, and listened to the answer. Miguel smiled. It was a small thing, but small things added up. Small acts of compassion, repeated again and again, until they became culture, until they became identity. That night, he visited Sophia's grave for the first time in 2 years. He brought flowers, not the sad kind, but bright yellow sunflowers that she would have loved. "Hey, baby girl," he whispered, kneeling beside the stone. "I'm sorry it took me so long to come back. I was lost for a while, but I think I'm finding my way." He told her about Richard, about the job, about the people he was helping. He told her about the photo he still carried, about how her superhero drawing had come true in ways he never expected. "You and Mama, you're still saving the day," he said, his voice breaking but steady. "Through me, through what you taught me about love and compassion and showing up even when it's hard. That doesn't end just because you're gone. That lives forever." The wind rustled through the cemetery trees, and for just a moment, Miguel could almost hear her laughter. He stood, wiped his eyes, and walked back to his car. Tomorrow, there would be more work to do, more people to see, more compassion to build into the foundation of a company that was learning to value humans over profits. It wasn't a fairy tale ending. The grief still lived in him. Some days were harder than others, but he'd learned that healing doesn't mean forgetting. It means carrying your losses with grace and letting them teach you how to love better. Richard Langford learned the same lesson. In his penthouse, surrounded by Catherine's journals and memories, he finally understood what she tried to tell him all along. The measure of a life isn't what you build, but who you become in the building. And two men, one who'd lost his way in wealth, one who'd lost his way in grief, found their way back to themselves by learning to see each other. From invisibility to recognition, from numbness to feeling, from walking past to stopping, always stopping because someone might need you. And that, in the end, was the only test that mattered. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story about compassion, redemption, and finding purpose after loss, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. These stories of unexpected connections between different worlds are what we're all about here. Drop a comment telling me, have you ever been invisible to others? Or have you stopped to see someone that society overlooks? Your stories inspire the content I create. See you in the next story.